The Park Maniac, the man who turned dreams into nightmares and terrorized a nation. Chapter 1. In the sprawling metropolis of São Paulo, Brazil, parks and green spaces served as precious refuges from the concrete jungle that housed over 10 million people. These areas were where families gathered for picnics, couples shared romantic moments, and joggers sought exercise and fresh air. But between 1998 and 1998, these sanctuaries of peace became hunting grounds for one of Brazil's most notorious serial killers, Francisco de Assis Pereira, who would become known as O Maníaco do Parque, the Park Maniac, transformed the city's beloved green spaces into scenes of terror. This motorcycle courier turned predator would assault and murder at least 11 women, while attempting to rape dozens more, creating a climate of fear that gripped not just São Paulo, but the entire nation. The case has been featured in numerous Brazilian documentaries, true crime series, and international media coverage as one of the most shocking criminal cases in Latin American history. The Park Maniac's reign of terror lasted only 8 months, but his impact on Brazilian society was profound and lasting. What made Francisco's crimes particularly disturbing was not just their brutality, but the calculated manner in which he selected his victims and locations. He specifically targeted women who were alone in parks, using his knowledge of the city gained through his work as a motorcycle courier to identify isolated areas where he could attack without being detected. The investigation that eventually led to his capture revealed a man whose outward appearance of normalcy masked a deeply disturbed individual with an insatiable appetite for violence against women. Francisco appeared to be an ordinary working man, but beneath this facade lurked a predator who viewed women as objects to be dominated and destroyed. The Park Maniac case exposed significant flaws in Brazil's law enforcement capabilities and highlighted the vulnerability of women in public spaces. The investigation was hampered by poor communication between different police jurisdictions, inadequate forensic capabilities, and a justice system that was unprepared to deal with a serial killer of this magnitude. Francisco's crimes also reflected broader social issues in Brazilian society, including attitudes toward women, violence, and public safety. His case became a catalyst for discussions about women's rights, urban security, and the need for better protection of vulnerable populations. As we delve into this disturbing case, we must confront uncomfortable truths about predatory behavior, the vulnerability of women in public spaces, and the societal factors that can create and enable monsters like Francisco de Assis Pereira. If you're prepared for this mature and disturbing content about one of Brazil's most notorious criminals, make sure to subscribe. The psychological journey we're about to explore reveals how ordinary-seeming individuals can harbor the darkest impulses. Chapter 2. The Making of a Monster. Francisco de Assis Pereira was born on June 29, 1967, in the small town of Ituverava, in the interior of São Paulo state. His childhood was marked by poverty, family dysfunction, and early signs of the psychological problems that would later manifest in his horrific crimes. The youngest of 7 children, Francisco grew up in an environment where violence and instability were commonplace. His father was an alcoholic who frequently beat his wife and children, creating a household atmosphere of fear and unpredictability. Francisco's mother struggled to provide for the large family while enduring domestic abuse, and the children often went without basic necessities. This early exposure to violence and the devaluation of women would prove to be formative experiences in Francisco's psychological development. As a child, Francisco was described by neighbors and teachers as withdrawn, aggressive, and prone to violent outbursts. He had difficulty forming relationships with peers and showed little empathy for others. These early behavioral problems were largely ignored by his overwhelmed family and the underfunded school system in his impoverished community. Francisco's academic performance was poor, and he left school at an early age to work and help support his family. His lack of education and limited opportunities contributed to his sense of frustration and resentment towards society. He felt that life had been unfair to him and that he deserved better than what he had been given. In his late teens, Francisco moved to São Paulo in search of better opportunities. The massive city offered the promise of work and a chance to escape his troubled past, but it also provided anonymity that would later facilitate his crimes. He found work as a motorcycle courier, a job that would prove crucial to his later criminal activities. Working as a motorcycle courier gave Francisco intimate knowledge of São Paulo's geography, including the location of parks, isolated areas, and escape routes throughout the city. He spent his days navigating the urban landscape, learning which areas were busy and which were secluded, information that he would later use to select locations for his attacks. Francisco's personal relationships were troubled and unsuccessful. He had difficulty maintaining romantic relationships with women, often becoming possessive, controlling, and violent when his advances were rejected. His inability to form healthy relationships with women contributed to his growing resentment and hostility toward the opposite sex. Colleagues who worked with Francisco described him as quiet and unremarkable, someone who blended into the background and didn't attract attention. This ordinary appearance would later serve as perfect camouflage for his criminal activities, allowing him to approach victims without arousing suspicion. During his early years in São Paulo, Francisco began exhibiting increasingly concerning behavior toward women. He would follow women on his motorcycle, make inappropriate comments and gestures, and engage in voyeuristic activities. These behaviors escalated gradually, serving as a prelude to the more serious crimes he would later commit. Francisco's psychological profile showed classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including a lack of empathy, disregard for social norms, and a pattern of manipulative and exploitative behavior. He viewed women as objects to be conquered and controlled, rather than as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. The combination of his troubled childhood, social isolation, professional mobility, and psychological disorders created the perfect conditions for Francisco to develop into a serial predator. His work as a motorcycle courier provided him with the tools and knowledge he needed to hunt victims effectively. While avoiding detection, make sure to share this story with others who can handle mature content about criminal psychology and predatory behavior. By the mid-1990s, Francisco had begun engaging in increasingly serious criminal behavior, including attempted sexual assaults and harassment of women in public spaces. These early crimes went largely unreported or uninvestigated, allowing him to refine his methods and build confidence in his ability to avoid consequences. The man who would become known as the Park Maniac was the product of a toxic combination of personal trauma, social dysfunction, and psychological pathology. His transformation from troubled child to serial killer illustrates how untreated mental health issues, combined with social factors and opportunity, can create individuals capable of unimaginable violence. Chapter 3. The Reign of Terror begins. The first confirmed attack by the man who would become known as the Park Maniac occurred on February 15, 1998, in Ibirapuera Park, one of São Paulo's most beloved public spaces. The victim was a 19-year-old university student who had been jogging alone in the early morning hours when Francisco approached her on his motorcycle, dragged her into a secluded area, and brutally assaulted her. The attack followed a pattern that would become Francisco's signature. He would scout parks and green areas during his work as a motorcycle courier, identifying isolated locations and potential escape routes. He would then return during off hours, typically in the early morning or late evening when fewer people were around, to hunt for victims. Francisco's method was calculated and predatory. He would approach women who were alone, often joggers or people walking through parks, and use his motorcycle to quickly close the distance between himself and his intended victim. His knowledge of the city's layout allowed him to select locations where he could attack without being seen and escape quickly if necessary. The brutality of Francisco's attacks was shocking even by the standards of a city accustomed to high levels of violence. He would not only sexually assault his victims, but would often beat them severely, sometimes using rocks or other objects found in the park. The level of violence suggested that he derived pleasure not just from the sexual assault, but from the act of inflicting pain and terror. After the first attack, Francisco's confidence grew and the frequency of his crimes increased dramatically. Within weeks, he had attacked several more women in different parks throughout São Paulo. Each attack was more violent than the last, suggesting that Francisco was escalating both in terms of frequency and brutality. The São Paulo police initially treated each attack as an isolated incident, failing to recognize the pattern that was emerging. Poor communication between different police precincts meant that information about the attacks was not being shared effectively, allowing Francisco to continue his crimes without detection. Francisco's first murder occurred on April 12, 1998, when he killed 23-year-old Selma Regina, a psychology student who had been walking through Trianon Park in the upscale Paulista Avenue area. The murder marked a significant escalation in Francisco's criminal behavior and demonstrated that he was willing to kill to avoid identification or simply to satisfy his violent impulses. The murder of Selma Regina sent shockwaves through São Paulo society. The victim was an educated middle-class woman from a good family, and her death in one of the city's most prestigious areas shattered the illusion that anyone was safe from the predator who was stalking the city's parks. As news of the attack spread, women throughout São Paulo began changing their behavior. Jogging alone became unthinkable, and many parks that had once been bustling with activity became virtually deserted, especially during early morning and evening hours when Francisco typically struck. The media coverage of the attacks was intense and often sensationalized, with newspapers and television stations providing detailed coverage of each crime. While this coverage helped warn potential victims, it also provided Francisco with information about the police investigation and may have helped him refine his methods to avoid capture. Francisco's crimes were not limited to parks, though these remained his preferred hunting grounds. He also attacked women in other isolated areas throughout the city, including construction sites, vacant lots, and quiet residential streets. His mobility as a motorcycle courier allowed him to strike across a wide geographic area, making it difficult for police to predict where he might attack next. The psychological impact of Francisco's crimes extended far beyond his direct victims. Women throughout São Paulo lived in fear, altering their daily routines and avoiding public spaces that had once been considered safe. The attacks created a climate of terror that affected millions of people and fundamentally changed how residents of the city thought about public safety. Don't forget to hit that like button if you're finding this analysis of criminal escalation as disturbing as we are. By the summer of 1998, Francisco had attacked dozens of women and murdered several more. His crimes had evolved from opportunistic assaults to calculated hunts, and his level of violence had increased, to the point where survival for his victims was often a matter of chance rather than anything they could control. The park maniac had transformed São Paulo's green spaces from places of recreation and relaxation into hunting grounds for a predator whose appetite for violence seemed insatiable. The city that prided itself on its parks and public spaces was being held hostage by one man's twisted desires and violent impulses. Chapter 4. The investigation struggles. The investigation into the park maniac's crimes was hampered from the beginning by a combination of institutional failures, resource limitations, and the unprecedented nature of the case. Brazilian law enforcement in the 1990s was not equipped to handle a serial killer who operated across multiple jurisdictions with such calculated precision. The first major problem was the lack of coordination between different police precincts in São Paulo. Each attack was initially investigated as a separate incident by the local precinct where it occurred, with little communication between different units. This fragmented approach meant that patterns in the attacks were not identified quickly, allowing Francisco to continue his crimes while police treated each case in isolation. Detective Carlos Alberto Marchi was eventually assigned to coordinate the investigation after it became clear that the attacks were connected. Marchi was an experienced investigator, but he faced enormous challenges in trying to piece together information from multiple crime scenes and jurisdictions while working with limited resources and outdated technology. The forensic capabilities available to Brazilian police in 1998 were primitive compared to modern standards. DNA analysis was available but limited, fingerprint databases were incomplete, and crime scene investigation techniques were often inadequate. This meant that even when Francisco left evidence at crime scenes, investigators often lacked the tools to analyze it effectively. Witness testimony was often unreliable or contradictory, partly because the attacks typically occurred in isolated areas with few witnesses, and partly because the trauma experienced by survivors affected their ability to provide accurate descriptions. The few witnesses who did see Francisco often provided conflicting descriptions of his appearance and his motorcycle. The investigation was also complicated by false confessions and misleading tips from the public. The intense media coverage of the case generated hundreds of calls to police, most of which proved to be dead ends. Investigators had to waste valuable time and resources following up on false leads, while the real perpetrator continued his attacks. Francisco's knowledge of police procedures, gained through his work as a motorcycle courier who frequently interacted with law enforcement, helped him stay ahead of the investigation. He understood how police operated, knew which areas were heavily patrolled, and could adapt his methods to avoid detection. The geographic scope of Francisco's crimes created additional challenges for investigators. He attacked women across a wide area of São Paulo, from wealthy neighborhoods to poor suburbs, making it difficult to predict where he might strike next. His mobility as a motorcycle courier allowed him to cover large distances quickly and escape before police could respond. Public pressure on the police to solve the case was intense, with media outlets and politicians demanding results. This pressure sometimes led to hasty decisions and premature arrests of suspects who were later released when evidence proved their innocence. These false arrests damaged public confidence in the investigation and may have made the real perpetrator more cautious. The investigation team eventually developed a profile of the attacker based on witness descriptions and crime scene analysis. They determined that he was likely a man in his 20s or 30s who rode a motorcycle and had detailed knowledge of São Paulo's geography. However, this profile was broad enough to include thousands of potential suspects. Police began conducting surveillance of parks and increasing patrols in areas where attacks had occurred. But Francisco adapted to these measures by changing his patterns and targeting new locations. His ability to modify his behavior in response to police activity demonstrated a level of cunning that made him particularly difficult to catch. The breakthrough in the case came not from traditional investigative work, but from a combination of luck and Francisco's own growing recklessness. As his crimes escalated in frequency and violence, he began taking greater risks and making mistakes that would eventually lead to his identification and capture. Make sure to subscribe to follow this complex investigation to its dramatic conclusion. The investigation into the Park MANIAC revealed significant weaknesses in Brazil's law enforcement capabilities and highlighted the need for better coordination between different police units, improved forensic capabilities, and more sophisticated investigative techniques. These lessons would later influence reforms in Brazilian policing and criminal investigation procedures. Despite the challenges they faced, the investigators working on the Park MANIAC case demonstrated dedication and persistence in their efforts to stop Francisco's reign of terror. Their work, while ultimately successful, illustrated both the difficulties of catching a sophisticated serial killer and the importance of modern investigative tools and techniques. Chapter 5. The Final Attacks and Capture. By August 1998, Francisco de Assis Pereira had become increasingly bold and reckless in his attacks. The success of his previous crimes had given him a sense of invincibility, and he began taking greater risks that would ultimately lead to his downfall. His final series of attacks demonstrated both the escalation of his violence and the mistakes that would finally allow police to identify and capture him. On August 2nd, 1998, Francisco committed what would be his final murder, killing 34-year-old Elisangela Antonio in Ibirapuera Park. The attack was particularly brutal, even by Francisco's standards, and demonstrated that his violence was continuing to escalate. The murder occurred in broad daylight, showing that Francisco had become dangerously overconfident in his ability to avoid detection. The investigation had been intensifying throughout the summer, with police increasing surveillance in parks and developing more sophisticated investigative techniques. Detective Marchi and his team had been working around the clock to identify patterns in the attacks and develop leads that might help them catch the perpetrator. The breakthrough came when investigators began focusing on motorcycle couriers as potential suspects. The profile they had developed suggested that the attacker had detailed knowledge of São Paulo's geography and was highly mobile, characteristics that fit the courier profession perfectly. This insight led them to begin investigating courier companies and their employees. Francisco's downfall began when he attempted to attack a woman who fought back more effectively than his previous victims. On August 4th, 1998, he approached a 25-year-old woman jogging in Villa Lobos Park, but she managed to escape and got a clear look at both Francisco and his motorcycle license plate. Her description and the license plate number provided police with their first concrete lead. The license plate led investigators directly to Francisco, who was registered as the owner of the motorcycle used in the attack. When police ran his name through their databases, they discovered that he worked as a motorcycle courier and fit the profile they had developed for the Park MANIAC. Surveillance of Francisco began immediately, with undercover officers monitoring his movements and activities. The surveillance revealed that he was continuing to scout parks and follow women, behavior that confirmed investigators' suspicions that they had found their suspect. On August 6, 1998, police observed Francisco following a woman jogger in Ibirapuera Park. As he approached the woman with apparent intent to attack, officers moved in and arrested him. The arrest was dramatic and highly publicized, with news crews capturing footage of Francisco being taken into custody. During questioning, Francisco initially denied involvement in the attacks, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Police had witness testimony, forensic evidence from crime scenes, and surveillance footage that linked him to multiple attacks. Faced with this evidence, Francisco eventually confessed to his crimes. Francisco's confession was detailed and chilling, revealing the calculated nature of his attacks and his complete lack of remorse for his victims. He described how he selected victims, planned his attacks, and carried out the assaults with clinical precision. His confession provided closure for many victims' families, but also revealed the true extent of his crimes. The confession revealed that Francisco had attacked far more women than police had initially realized. In addition to the 11 confirmed murders, he admitted to attempting to rape dozens of other women, many of whom had never reported the attacks to police. The true scope of his crimes was staggering. Francisco's arrest brought an immediate sense of relief to São Paulo residents, particularly women who had been living in fear for months. Parks that had been virtually deserted began to see visitors return, and the climate of terror that had gripped the city began to lift. The capture of the park MANIAC was celebrated as a major victory for Brazilian law enforcement. But it also highlighted the significant challenges that had been faced during the investigation. The case demonstrated the need for better coordination between police units, improved forensic capabilities, and more sophisticated investigative techniques. Don't forget to like this video if you're finding this conclusion as dramatic as the crimes themselves. Francisco's arrest marked the end of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in Brazilian history. His 8-month reign of terror had claimed at least 11 lives and traumatized an entire city. But his capture finally brought justice for his victims and their families. The investigation that led to Francisco's capture became a case study in both the challenges of catching a serial killer and the importance of persistence and innovation in criminal investigation. The lessons learned from the Park MANIAC case would influence Brazilian law enforcement for years to come. Chapter 6. Trial, Conviction, and Legacy. The trial of Francisco de Assis Pereira began on March 15, 1999, and immediately became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Brazilian history. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, survivors, media representatives, and members of the public who wanted to see justice served for the crimes that had terrorized São Paulo. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Helena Bicalho, presented overwhelming evidence against Francisco, including forensic evidence from crime scenes, witness testimony from survivors, and Francisco's own detailed confessions. The evidence painted a picture of a calculated predator who had systematically hunted and killed innocent women across the city. Francisco's defense team, appointed by the court, faced an almost impossible task given the strength of the evidence against their client. They attempted to argue that Francisco was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions. But psychiatric evaluations showed that while he had personality disorders, he was legally sane and understood the nature of his crimes. The testimony from survivors was particularly powerful and emotional. Women who had escaped Francisco's attacks described their ordeals in graphic detail, providing the court with first-hand accounts of his brutality and the lasting trauma his crimes had caused. Their courage in testifying helped ensure that Francisco would face the full consequences of his actions. The families of Francisco's murder victims also testified about the impact his crimes had had on their lives. Parents, siblings, and children of the victims described how the murders had destroyed their families and left them struggling to cope with their loss. Their testimony provided a human face to the statistics and helped the court understand the true cost of Francisco's crimes. Francisco himself showed no remorse during the trial, often appearing bored or indifferent during testimony about his crimes. His lack of emotion and apparent inability to understand the suffering he had caused reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was a dangerous predator who needed to be permanently removed from society. The trial also revealed additional details about Francisco's crimes that had not been previously known. Evidence showed that he had been planning his attacks carefully, sometimes stalking potential victims for days before striking. The level of premeditation demonstrated that his crimes were not impulsive acts, but calculated hunts. On July 20, 1999, Francisco de Assis Pereira was convicted on all charges, including 11 counts of murder and dozens of counts of attempted rape and sexual assault. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. Francisco was sentenced to 268 years in prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed in Brazilian criminal history. Under Brazilian law, he would serve a maximum of 30 years before becoming eligible for parole. But the length of the sentence reflected the severity of his crimes and society's desire to see him punished appropriately. The conviction of the park maniac was celebrated throughout Brazil as a victory for justice and law enforcement. The case had captured national attention and had become a symbol of the country's struggle against violence and crime. Francisco's conviction provided closure for victims' families and reassurance to the public that dangerous criminals could be caught and punished. The park maniac case had lasting impacts on Brazilian society and law enforcement. The investigation revealed significant weaknesses in police coordination and forensic capabilities, leading to reforms that improved the country's ability to investigate complex crimes. New protocols were established for handling serial crime cases and sharing information between different police units. The case also influenced public policy regarding women's safety and public spaces. New security measures were implemented in parks and recreational areas, including improved lighting, increased police patrols, and emergency communication systems. These measures helped restore public confidence in the safety of public spaces. Make sure to share this story with others interested in how criminal cases can influence social change and law enforcement. Reform. The park maniac case became a subject of academic study and was used to train law enforcement officers throughout Latin America. The investigation techniques used to catch Francisco and the lessons learned from the case were shared with police agencies in other countries facing similar challenges. Francisco's crimes also sparked broader discussions about violence against women in Brazilian society. The case highlighted the vulnerability of women in public spaces and contributed to growing awareness of gender-based violence as a serious social problem requiring comprehensive solutions. More than 2 decades after his conviction, Francisco de Assis Pereira remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. His case continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting public safety and the need for effective law enforcement to combat serious crime. The park maniac's reign of terror lasted only 8 months, but his impact on Brazilian society was profound and lasting. His case changed how the country thinks about public safety, criminal investigation, and the protection of vulnerable populations. While his crimes were horrific, the response to them demonstrated society's capacity to learn, adapt, and improve in the face of unprecedented challenges. The man who turned dreams into nightmares and terrorized a nation ultimately became a catalyst for positive change, as Brazil used the lessons learned from his crimes to build a safer and more just society for all its citizens. If this story of crime, investigation, and justice has been as compelling as it has been disturbing, subscribe to the channel to discover other real cases that have shaped our understanding of criminal behavior and the pursuit of justice.